have the very tough job of keeping everyone awake after lunch. I will try and do that. Can't make any promises though. If you have some questions throughout, find her. She has a microphone just so we can repeat the question. But with that, let's get started. This is a Spring Developer's Guide to Navigating the Front-End Landscape. So how many people in here think the world of front-end development moves too fast, can be a little bit confusing, and way too many projects to keep up with? All right, you're in the right room. If you didn't raise your hand, you probably know more than me, so it's okay if you want to go to another session. So I want to start with, we all got into this industry for different reasons. Some of us might have had an interest in computer programming. Some of us might have saw a lucrative career, right? It doesn't matter how we got into this, but early on, we try and find something that really inspires us, right? Something we're passionate about. And if you're lucky enough to get to do that throughout your career, you should consider that a big win. For me, since day one, it's always been building for the web. I love back-end development. That is my passion. But there's always something like real about getting something out on the web, right? I've been doing it my whole career, and it's just something that's satisfying. But it's not something I've always been very good at. I wouldn't even say I'm very good at it now. When I started doing front-end development, it looked a lot different. I've been doing this a long time. Maybe not as long as dinosaurs roamed the earth, but it feels like that. When I got started, I was using tools like FrontPage and Dreamweaver and using the WYSIWYG's editors. And I would drop something on a page and see what kind of code it produced. And that's how I kind of learned front-end development, even though that's probably not a great way because some of those editors never produced really good code, right? And then ultimately, I would see if it got to work in IE6 because we had to do that for so long, right? So that's kind of how I got started. Design was never something I was good at. I wasn't a designer, but I really enjoyed the aesthetics of like a good-looking website, right? I wanted to get better at that, and that still kind of drives me today, even though primarily what I'm doing is back-end development. There are times when I'm working on front-end projects. So I have a personal website. I'll talk about that in a second, but I think one of the kind of themes here is, for me, is if you want to get better at something, you have to put the reps in. So you got to find ways to keep practicing this practice. So I found reasons to do this. I started my own website. I had a friend that was starting his own business, so I'd get involved in that. I started a nonprofit in Cleveland, where I'm from, and so I got to work on that website over time. And this is really kind of how I got better at this. So this is a really ugly website. This is like my first blog back in 2005. But it was a lot of fun to put together. There weren't a lot of options like there are today with GitHub and YouTube. So I really wanted to start a resource. When I found something wrong, I can go out and teach it. And it also got me involved in open source and building my own thing, right? So this was a lot of fun to put together. And then over time, it's kind of evolved. Nothing great, right? This starts to look a little bit better. This one was my previous website I really enjoyed. I kind of learned a lot about CSS, and just making that little curve was like a challenge itself, right? So these are things that, if you start building things, you'll start running into these problems the same way you do in back-end development, and we'll kind of teach you like this. And then this is my current website built on Vue and Nux3 and Tailwind CSS, and it has a whole bunch of really good features that I'm really proud of. So I enjoy kind of building these things. And so my thing to you today is, does the front end change a lot? Yes, it does, but so do we. And so what I want to do today is really cover at a high level some of the ways that we can build front ends for our application. We'll talk about this at a high level. We're not going to dive deep into any of these, but my hope is you can walk away from this going, okay, on my next project, this is a technology stack that I can use for that project. So a little bit about me. I'm a husband and a father. My beautiful wife, Jen, our two daughters, Isabella and Juliana. We live outside of Cleveland, Ohio. I was named a Java champion this year, which is really exciting. That was like a lifelong career goal, so that was really exciting for me. I've been doing this for a long time. Again, dinosaur picture. I put up 23 years. I hate writing that number, but I've worn a lot of different hats in this industry, so I've been able to do a lot of different things. Probably my most favorite hat is the one that I'm wearing now, which is Spring Developer Advocate. I was an advocate long before anybody was paying me to do so. One of the messages I kind of always give to everyone is, you don't need permission to advocate for the things that you're passionate about, right? So if you enjoy Java, if you enjoy Spring, advocate for them. And things turn out really well for me because I get to do this every day now. I enjoy creating content. You can find more at danvega.dev. I'm still on the Bird app at the real Dan Vega, and I enjoy running and golf. So we started a live stream called Spring Office Hours every Monday, usually around 1 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be doing a live version of this tomorrow at the booth, so if you want to stop down, check that out. If you've not heard of this yet, this is a great way to get informed on everything that's going on in the Spring ecosystem. We go ahead and talk about new releases, things that are coming, and answer your questions. So if that's not something that's on your radar, check it out. It's a free resource. So again, this is at a high level. What I want to do is, okay, we have this Spring application. We need to build a front end for it. What are some of the options that we have? So we're going to take a look at Java frameworks. We're going to take a look. This is a Spring conference. I'll just mention Spring MVC. We'll take a look at an example of that in case you haven't seen that before. We'll take a look at a project called Vaadin. They have a booth downstairs. If you haven't heard of it yet, hopefully I'll introduce you to that. And then we'll dive into the JavaScript libraries and frameworks. So again, there's a lot changing in this space. I think kind of my mission here is to just provide you with a few libraries, a few tools that maybe you haven't heard of yet that might simplify some of this in this space. We'll talk about JavaScript frameworks. There's a lot going on in that space too. Maybe we'll kind of distill that down a little and how that works in Spring Boot applications. We'll mention HTMX, which if you haven't heard of yet is not kind of a newish technology for being able to write dynamic applications without writing JavaScript. And I know that sounds strange, but that is the kind of promise of HTMX, right? And then we'll kind of close this up with how do I choose? Like there's all these different ways that we could build applications. How do I choose which one is the right one for my next project? So let's start with Java frameworks. For Java developers, how can we leverage our existing Java skills to build UIs? So there are a bunch of frameworks out there. This is not all of them. This is not an exhaustive list, but there are some here. Spring MVC, in the Spring world, we'll dive into that. I mentioned Vaadin. The company Vaadin also produces a project called Hilla. We won't get too much into that today, but I will kind of give you some resources for that. There's a really cool project called JHipster, which combines like front-end development with back-end development using Spring Boot and different front-end frameworks. If you're going to build desktop apps, JavaFX is a really great choice. Struts still kind of near and dear to my heart because I started like 21 years ago. My first project was in Struts. It's still going on. I looked the other day, and it's still being developed actively, so pretty cool to see. And then Java Server Faces is another one that you can use. I'm going to kind of hone in on two of those, though. Spring MVC. We are at a Spring conference. I should mention Spring MVC. I'm guessing most of you have heard of it. Maybe some of you are only using it for building APIs. Maybe you didn't know that you can use this to kind of build front ends, so we'll take a look at that. So Spring MVC is the original web framework built on the Servlet API, and it's been included in the Spring M framework from the very beginning. It uses this kind of technology called a front dispatcher servlet, and we have many different template engines. So we take in a request, and then we delegate to some kind of template engine to render out what we're trying to render, right? If you go to the Spring Initializer, there's 4 in there included, I believe. I don't know if there's any more than that, but Timeleaf is there, FreeMaker, Mustache, and Groovy Templates. I know another one Thomas is a very big fan of is JTE. That's not included in there, but you can still use other template technologies in here as well. I'm going to use Timeleaf today just because kind of it's the most popular one, and one of the things I love is that it's a natural templating language. So its main goal is to bring natural templates to your workflow. This can be so if I hand this off to a designer, they can still work in it. There's anything special to like Java, and it gives you a nice collaboration between your development teams. So let's see a quick example. I love this slide. Check out my demo. Let's see a quick demo of this, and let's see if this will work. Yes. So I have a normal Spring Boot project here. When I go to start.spring.io, I pick web, I pick a template engine. In this case, it's Timeleaf. And I created a controller called Session Controller. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on here. So I have this JSON file of all the sessions at Spring I/O 2024. And I think I have a repository that is just going to load that up. So we just read that JSON file, we load it into memory, and now we can get a list of those. So I'm here in a session controller. We've marked this with the @controller annotation. So we're going to start looking for request mappings in here. So what I want to do is just go ahead and create a get mapping. So I'm going to create this on the root. So when we go to localhost 8080, this is what is going to get hit. And then we're just going to create a public string. We'll call this home. And when we're in the context of a Spring MVC application that is rendering templates, what we are returning here is the template that we want to render. So I say return, and then in this case, it's in a session folder, and we'll call it index.html. So that's all I do for the controller method. Now, in my templates session, I can create a new file. We'll say index.html. And you don't want to watch me type, so I'm going to use a live template here to throw some HTML in here. And all we're doing here, one, we have this Timeleaf directive. This kind of tells us that we can use these different Timeleaf directives like THText and THEach. And we have this script. I'm just pulling in Tailwind for some styling. So we have Spring IO sessions, and then we use Timeleaf here to iterate over those. So we're saying for every session, oh, and we actually forgot something. Let's go back here. So now what I need to do is make all the sessions that are in the repository available in that template. And so what I can do is I can come in here and say, hey, model, and then I can say model.add attribute, and we can name this sessions. And what we can do is use that repository's findAll method that returns a list of those sessions. So now in here I can say, hey, for each session in sessions, I want you to go ahead and output the title using that Timeleaf attribute, so THText, and I want you to output the speakers as a string. And then we're also doing, we're using another attribute here to say, hey, if that title contains a workshop, please go ahead and just add a green background to it. So not a whole lot going on, but easy to get going to build a front end here in Spring. So I've started my application. If I go to localhost 8080, I just see my title, my nice table, and then my styling if we find workshop in there. So again, this is kind of typical Spring MVC. If you've never seen it before, that's how you can get started, kind of 101, building front ends for your Spring applications. Now, a really good example of this is, let me do this. Sorry. A really good example of this is the Spring Pet Clinic. So we've all probably seen this example at some point, but if we go into this code, this is using Spring MVC. So if you want to see a more exhaustive example of how to use Spring MVC and Timeleaf and different templates, this is a really good example of that. All right, so Vaadin. You can learn more about Vaadin at vaadin.com. I mentioned Spring Office Hours earlier. We did an interview with one of the developer advocates there, Lawrence Lockhart. He did a really good job of explaining, Vaadin is the company. Vaadin has different products, one of which is Vaadin Flow, one of which is Hilla, and then they have some other things on top of that. So if you want to learn more about that, check that out. So the requirements, JDK 17, we need to be on at least 17, which is okay, because we're writing Spring Boot 3 apps, so the baseline is JDK 17. If you head over there, you can learn more about this at vaadin.com. I really love this product. I love the company. I love the team behind it. I think I saw Marcus climb in here too. There's Marcus back there. I love everything about this team and their products. This is really great for building data-centric business applications. Not only that, but that's kind of one use case for it. Building back office applications, there's a really rich set of components for building nice looking UIs without having to figure out how to do that yourself, right? So the components build on a customizable theme, which means you can change things like colors and roundness and spacing and fonts using CSS variables. One thing I really love are the components are tested to ensure good accessibility with assistive technologies like screen readers. Usually this is, unfortunately, an afterthought. I like that this is kind of put into the framework, so you know that if you're using Vaadin, you are making sure that you have good accessibility. So again, Vaadin has two full stack frameworks, Flow and Hilla. Flow lets you build front ends purely in Java. So we write all Java code, we get a nice Java front end for the web. Hilla actually combines Spring Boot with something like a React front end. So it kind of puts those two together. So if one of those interests you, go ahead and check those out. Now again, if you head over to the documentation, you can see all the different UI components for Vaadin. In there, you'll see, it starts with different layouts. So, hey, we need a layout to build our application. Give me something to kind of start with. And then you can start to mix and match some of these layouts together to build more complicated UIs. Again, you can style everything. They have Figma libraries. So if you have like a design team and they want to kind of prototype something out first using those components, they can. And again, thought with accessibility first. And then you can go into the docs and kind of see all of the different components or UI components that they have. So we have some like data entry here. We have one like a date picker. This is not something you want to like build yourself, right? So all the components that you'd expect from a library here, including a data grid, which we're going to look at today. So if I wanted to get started with Vaadin, there are a couple different ways. If you go to the main homepage of Vaadin and get started, there's some links to different things in there, one of which is their kind of like their Spring initializer. It's their starter. So I think it's at start.vaadin.com. You can go in and it says there's a Hello World project there already configured for you. But you can go down and edit that and say change some different configurations of that. But the default is using Vaadin Flow, Java, Maven, and Spring Boot. So you can download that and open that up in your IDE. You can also go to the Spring initializer. So if you go to start.spring.io, we pick web, we pick Vaadin. There's a starter for Vaadin on there. And then I usually include Spring Boot's dev tools. Especially in this case, you want dev tools. So we kind of restart that every time. And then something like the actuator. So let's look at what this might look like in Java. So I'm going to go back here. Make sure we stop that. Sessions. All right, so I have a similar project where I'm loading a bunch of sessions from that JSON file, and I want to be able to display these. So I created a new class called Session View. Here's the kind of key of this is I'm setting a route. This is from Vaadin. This is how we're going to kind of map things to URLs. In this case, I'm saying at the root of the endpoint, the root endpoint, this is where I want this view to kind of exist. So you can say Session View extends one of the layouts that exist already, like the horizontal layout or the vertical layout. And again, you can start to like combine these together. So I have a constructor here. I'm going to throw some code in here. So Session View, and we'll talk about this. So first I'm going to kind of set some layout properties. I'm setting the size to full. I'm saying, hey, align this in the middle. And then I'm starting to add some of these UI components to my screen. So first I'm creating an H1. I'm saying, hey, this is the new title. I create a new H1 with the title Spring IO Sessions. Then I grab the grid. And again, I'm looking at all this through the documentation. I'm learning how to create these components in the docs. So I'm saying, hey, new grid, based on this session record that I have. If you look at this session record, it just contains a title and a list of speakers. I am auto-creating columns false. You could let it kind of create that for you. But I'm just showing you that you can have a little bit more flexibility over each of the columns. So I'm saying the first column is title. Here's the header. The second column is speakers. Here's the header. And then there's some like theme variants. Again, we said you can kind of like style things differently. Each component has different ways you can style it. In this case, instead of like a bigger table, I want these like compact rows. So I'm setting a theme variant for those compact rows. Then I get the data from the repository, and I just say, hey, grid, these are the items for the grid. So once we set that, I'm just doing a little bit more layout here. Now that I have a vertical layout in my main class here, but I also want to lay out my title and my grid in a vertical layout. I could use like a horizontal layout and put my title to the left and my grid to the right, but in this case, I kind of want them stacked on each other. So I'm just setting some of those. I'm calling this add method to add that container. And with that, we should be able to run this project. Go to localhost 8080, and that will load this because of this route here. Let's look at this. And so again, that's a little bit different. We didn't do any styling on this grid, but we also got a decent looking grid without having to do much, right? Like we didn't have to like bring in Tailwind or bring in Bootstrap or do any of that stuff. We just wrote this in Java and pulled one of the components out of the framework. And then again, you can do a whole bunch of styling on top of this. But The only thing we looked at here was the grid and the H1 and a couple of the layouts. There are a lot of different components in the library that you can check out. And again, for me, if I don't want to have to deal with like, how do I make this look nice, this is a go-to for me. All right, let's stop this. All right, so that's Java. Let's talk about JavaScript libraries and frameworks. So I'm going to start with package managers, build tools, and runtimes. Oh my, this seems like to be the scary space because there's so many different things going on in the front end space, and I want to talk a little bit about this. So there are some package managers out there. Package manager is a system that will manage your project dependencies. It will provide a method to install new dependencies, also referred to as packages, manages where packages are stored on your file system, and offer capabilities for you to publish your own packages. So here's some popular ones out there. NPM we'll talk about in the next slide, but there are also other ones. PNPM, if you've heard of that before but not sure what that is, it is different than NPM. Again, they found there were some issues with NPM, and PNPM it's called performance NPM, and they solved some of the performance issues by basically instead of placing node modules folders like in every single project, they basically install dependencies on one place on your machine and then use like a symlink to point to that. So that can be a little bit more performant, especially if you're running a ton of dependencies there. Yarn's another one. Again, it saw issues with NPM, security and performance. JSR is a new one. I have not even touched this yet, but it is from the creator of Node, Ryan Dahl. And similar to how TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, this is a superset of NPM. So similar, uses same package manager locations and everything. So these are some package managers that you can look at. Now, NPM is probably the biggest one, right? NPM consists of 3 distinct components. It has a website where you can discover packages, set up profiles, manage other aspects of your NPM experience. CLI, this is what runs from the terminal. This is how most developers interact with NPM. And then there's a registry. There's a large public database of JavaScript software and all of the meta information surrounding it. So to publish and install packages to and from the NPM registry or a private one, you need to install Node first. So you can install Node by going over to the website, running that command, or using something like a Node installer. So I'm going to strongly recommend using something like NVM here. If you haven't heard of it, this is Node Version Manager, and it allows you to basically control different parallel versions of the software. So we can consider that something similar to SDK Man in our world. We're used to using that tool to manage different dependencies. NVM is very similar, and if you want to get started with Node, this is a good place to go. Once you get it installed, you can run Node-V, you can run npm-v to get the different versions of that. Okay, so package managers. Build tools, this is one we should really talk about, right? Before ES modules were available in the browser, developers had no native mechanism for authoring JavaScript in a modular fashion. This is why we are all familiar with the concept of bundling. So these tools basically crawl, process, and concatenate all of our source files into something the browser can run. Again, this was a few years ago. So over time, we saw tools like Webpack, Rollup, Parcel. They greatly improved the front-end developer experience. But as we started to build these bigger applications, it wasn't uncommon for large projects to have thousands of modules. And so we started to hit performance bottlenecks, right? Unreasonably long time to kick up a dev server. I'm talking like minutes. Nobody wants to wait minutes for a dev server to kick up, right? Maybe even a few seconds for hot module replacement to take place. And this is not something we want to deal with, right? So there's been a lot of really great advancements in this area over the last couple of years, one of which is ESBuild. This is an extremely fast bundler for the web, written in Go. What, Go? What do we care about Go for? Anyways, it it's amazing because they've kind of ported this to like every language. So if you want to use this ES build, there are a bunch of different tools that actually use this to create basically really fast user experiences. And it says on there, our current build tools for the web are 10 to 100 times slower than they could be. So they aim to kind of solve that, and you can see from some of their benchmarks on their homepage. So I'm going to introduce you to a tool called Vite, if you haven't heard of it. It was created by the team behind Vue. I'm a big fan of Vue. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it has support for many frameworks. So it's not just a Vue tool. If you're using React, there's a plugin for Angular. Even if you're building out vanilla HTML or vanilla JavaScript sites, Vite has a kind of template for that. It uses ESBuild to pre-bundle all these dependencies, so very, very fast. Kicks up a dev server really fast. Hot module replacement is very fast. Extremely nice to work with. So that's my build tools. And then JavaScript runtimes. So we all know that JavaScript can run in the browser, but there are other runtime environments where JavaScript can be used. We've probably all heard of something like Node, but there are a couple other ones to put on your calendar or on your radar. Dino is one. If you're not familiar with Dino, you can start to look at the letters of Node and see that Dino can be spelled out. That's because the original creator of Node, Ryan Dahl, went on and said, I found a bunch of problems in Node that I'd like to fix, but I can't fix them in Node, so I'm going to start something new. This is pretty typical of the JavaScript world, it seems. But he started Dino, fresh start, based on TypeScript. And has some really nice features in it. So Dino is another runtime. Bun is a newer runtime. I have not had any experience with it, but I hear a lot of people say great things about it. They say it's the all-in-one toolkit. You get a runtime, a package manager, a bundler, a test runner. So these are some runtimes to take a look at. All right, so let's do a demo. I want to do a demo using Vite to create a vanilla JavaScript project. We're going to create a Dan GPT front end, so kind of like ChatGPT, but for me. And it's going to talk to a Spring Boot application, and this is going to be just in vanilla JavaScript. So let's go here. Oops. Can we see that? All right, so I am in a temp directory here. I'm going to create a new project using Vite. The way that I do that is npm create. So if you've never used npm before, we have these different kind of scripts we can run. Creates a shorthand for npm init, but allows us to use some different packages and templates. So I'm going to use Vite. So I'm saying npm create Vite at latest. I'm getting the latest version of Vite. And if I run this, now it's going to give me out some options, like let's scaffold out a project. I'm going to call this front end, and here's where I was saying it doesn't just support Vue. So I want to, all these different projects that I can use. I want to create a vanilla JavaScript project, and each of those usually has some other options. So if I wanted to create a TypeScript project, I could. So I'm going to say I have this vanilla JavaScript project. I'm going to cd into that. I'm going to run npm install, which basically installs all of the dependencies for that project. And I'm going to open this up in IntelliJ. New window. There. So what do we get out of this? So we get this package.json. Again, this is part of NPM. It has some metadata about our application. It has some scripts. Scripts are the way we can run different things in this project. And so when I'm npm run whatever name this is, that will run this script. So in this case, it's just kicking up Vite, but if we wanted to run a production build, we could. If we wanted to run a preview, we could. And you might ask, well, if I'm just creating a vanilla JavaScript project, why would I want all this extra ceremony to kind of get started with? And I liken it to a Java project. Even if I'm creating a brand new Java project, I'm using something like Maven, because at some point, I'm going to need a dependency in my project, right? So I like this as kind of my starter. This is our package.json. We have this index.html. This is using modules, so we kind of point to a JavaScript module. And I'm going to replace this with my index.html. Again, this is just kind of a scaffold of ChatGPT interface where I have some things on the left side. I have a box in the middle where I can type in a query, and get something back from OpenAI. So I'm also pointing to my main.js. So if I go into main.js, I'm going to, yes. So what I'm doing here is I'm just adding, again, this was a vanilla JavaScript project. So I'm saying, get me the element by the ID. So I'm having a chat form. I have an event listener when you submit it. Prevent the default. Give me the value that's in the message box. And then use this to call another API. That API is in Spring. This is on localhost 8080, which we don't have up yet. So let's go ahead and do that. Do I have another instance? No. So let's say, so we saw some examples of Spring AI this morning. This is just a very simple example of that, talking to OpenAI's GPT-4. It has this method that will generate a response from the LLM. And again, this is on localhost 8080/API/generate. I'm going to start this. And then I'm going to go into my front-end application. And again, the way that I can run this is by saying npm run dev. So you could see, again, I know we have a very small project here, but instant startup. And I haven't worked on like enterprise-grade applications with this, but I have worked on some pretty big apps, and it's still pretty fast. And so I get that started up right away, which means I can go to localhost 5173. And now I have this kind of ChatGPT interface. I can come in here and say, tell me a joke about dogs. Actually, I want a dad joke. Tell me a dad joke about dogs. And we should go off, go to the back end, get the response. Why didn't the dog sit in the shade? Because he didn't want to be a hot dog. That's a good one. So yeah, so that is really just an example of being able to scaffold out a quick project using a tool like Vite, hopefully putting that kind of tool on your radar. Again, even if you don't want to get into JavaScript frameworks and you just need a front end, maybe you just need a pretty simple index.html and a couple scripts. So that's a really good way to go. So let's do this. I want to stop that. And then I want to close that, stop that. And yes, okay. So, cool. All right, let's talk about JavaScript frameworks. So this is a collection of pre-written JavaScript code that really gives us a structure and some of the tools to build web apps more efficiently. Frameworks are designed to make the development process easier and more standardized, allowing developers to focus on functionality and features of their application rather than dealing with the complexities of low-level coding. Where does that sound familiar? Spring does that very same thing for us. So using a JavaScript framework can be really great. There are some great features that can come out of this. I like a few of these things, the component-based architecture. So many frameworks like React and Vue use a component-based architecture. This allows you to build kind of reusable components. I have a session list. I have a session that shows one session. Now I can use these in different places in my application without having to kind of reduplicate that. State management is something that you're going to get into if you're building front-end applications in JavaScript, and that's not something you want to manage yourself, so a lot of these frameworks have solutions for that. Again, routing is another one that you don't want to have to deal with yourself. Data binding, frameworks like Vue allow you to kind of bind to the data. So if I declare a sessions variable that contains a list of sessions, and I go off and get a list of those from the server, as soon as that variable is updated, it's now reflected in the DOM. You don't have to do that back and forth of, okay, I got the data, let me insert this into the DOM somehow. So data binding is very important. And then there are things like templating and performance optimization. Now, there are a lot of frameworks out there. We talked about this at the beginning. This is kind of my short list. There are more things that you can look at. Angular, been around forever. I know there was the big transition from AngularJS to Angular and that whole whatever happened there. But Angular, I've noticed, I've done a lot of consulting for large enterprises, and Angular is really big in the kind of enterprise space. So Angular is great. React, probably one of the biggest ones that you'll run across. This is developed by Facebook. And again, it says library there. React developers get very mad at you if you call it a framework, so don't call it a framework. It is a library, according to them. Vue, I fell in love with Vue. I did some work at a coding boot camp, and we had to figure out, like, okay, we just taught these students HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. What component framework could we teach them so that they can get started pretty quickly? And I found out that, like, Angular, you need TypeScript. Angular uses TypeScript heavily. So it's like we couldn't teach them TypeScript because we just didn't have the time. React, if you've ever seen JSX and you just learned HTML and CSS and JavaScript, that would look really weird to you, right? So we ended up using Vue, and I fell in love with it. They have single file components, so you can have all your script, your templates, and your CSS in one. Ember.js, again, still used pretty heavily. I've seen it on many enterprise projects that I've worked on, and Svelte's kind of one of the newcomers. It feels a lot like Vue to me. I haven't used it a lot, but it seems like they're borrowing a lot of ideas from Vue. But that's not to say, all these frameworks kind of borrow ideas from each other. So these are some good frameworks to get started. What I want to do is take a look at two quick examples of this. And again, depending on the requirements of your project, you can go different, a couple different ways. So maybe we have two different projects, right? We have a front-end application and we have a back-end application. So we have a Vue app that's kind of its standalone app. It's living in its own repo. It needs to talk to our Spring Boot app. And then the other one is maybe I have all of that combined into one single app. So let's look at Vue sessions. So, okay, so I'm not going to run this project, but this should look very familiar because I created this project using Vite. So I scaffolded out our new project. Again, I have like this package.json, has a few more dependencies this time because I'm including Vue. I was able to use some tools to install Tailwind properly instead of just kind of using a CDN in my project. And now in source, I have this app.vue. And now I can say, okay, I have this list of sessions. When this component is mounted, go out to that API and get those list of sessions, and then go ahead and set the value for sessions.value. And now using Vue, I just iterate over this. So this is an example of Vue, but some of the things you'll want to think of, no matter using Vue or React or Angular on the front end, one of the things that we always run into that I always get questions on is, I have this front end app, I'm talking to my back end app, why isn't it working, right? One of the things you can do is open up your dev tools and see what kind of errors are coming in. Most always, the first error that we hit is a CORS error, right? We're trying to talk from our front end to our back end, and we haven't enabled that on the back end. So you can add the @cross-origin annotation to that API. You can configure that however you need to, and then I'll kind of solve that problem. So that's kind of two separate apps. I want to dive a little bit deeper into what I'm calling a Fullstack Spring Vue app. And so if I say this window, so what I did is I created a Spring Boot app just as I normally would. It's using web. So if we go into Spring, let's actually look at this real quick. So I am using Java 21, the Spring Boot actuator, a web project. It has dev tools, and that's really it. So we get this source main Java, we get our main Spring Boot application, and I have a simple controller in here that is going to return a message. So again, I'm using that cross-origin. What you can do is do the same thing that we did with Vite before, but you can go into your Spring Boot application, so into source, and run npm create Vite at latest, right in my source file, right in my source folder. And what I end up with is this front-end project that should look pretty familiar at this point, right? We created it with Vite. It has a package.json. It has an app.vue. This app.vue delegates to a hello world component. And all this hello world component is doing is accessing /API/messages. And so it'll load that, return that message, and then set it to that, and we'll display it in the template. So in this scenario, you can also use environment variables. You can do some configuration on the Vite side so that you notice I didn't have to hard code in here localhost 8080. It just knew that /API is going to work. And the way that it did that is through something like Vite config. And I can say, hey, proxy all API requests through something like localhost 8080. And I'm using some environment variables to change that based on the environment I'm in. So that's kind of step one. I have these two separate projects. So if you remember back to kind of starting up that vanilla JavaScript project, we would say npm run dev. So we kind of have to do that here, right? We have two projects. I got to start Spring Boot, and then I got to run npm run dev to get both of those things up and running. You could do that, or you can write a little script to basically say, hey, run my Spring Boot app, wait a second, and then run the dev, npm run dev, and the prefix tells it what project we're going to run. And then I can also open a browser window to that specific port. So I'm going to run this. Hopefully this works. So it's going to start up Spring Boot, then it's going to wait, then it's going to kick up Vite and open up a browser to 5173, and there's our message. So this is our front-end app pulling from our back-end app. So it's hitting that API, returning that message, and displaying it in the browser. So this is great for development, but at the end of the day, when we move to production, we probably want one single artifact, right? We're going to build a jar file, we're going to build a container. How does this all kind of work together? And if we look in our POM here, we have a couple of new build plugins. So this plugin right here, this front-end Maven plugin, will install Node and NPM. It runs this npm install, and then it runs npm run build, which is what packages up that Vite application, that Vue application, into something that's ready for production. Then there's another plugin, that the Maven Resources plugin, that will basically copy this over to the static folder. So those two things alone, so if we come into, say, a terminal here and say that, if we run Maven clean install, this is going to run clean, get rid of the target folder, do an install, and then these other goals are executed. So it'll basically copy over that build process into that static folder, and at the end of the day, what we should get is a jar file that we can then run. So let's see. I wonder if it's the internet slowing me down here. Build success. Let's see. There we go. So what I want to do now, let's see. Let's see if we can, I don't know what is going on here. So I want to run whatever's in that target folder. I wonder if that's, let's just do this. So java-jar, target, and then Fullstack Vue. So this will kick up the port is in use, of course. So let's say kill -9 73 555. So if this starts up, now again we have that jar file. It has all of those dependencies in the static folder. If we go ahead, and now we were on 5173 the last time. That was the front end app. Now if I go to localhost 8080. Again, that's the same application, but now it's all running in that single artifact. That's what we can kind of deploy to production. All right. Okay, last but not least, HTMX. So we had a chance to look at some JavaScript frameworks. Let's look at a library that takes a little bit different approach. With HTMX, we can use attributes to add some dynamic capabilities to our application. So when I started, we basically created this client that talked to a server. You could pick whatever language or MVC framework you want to, but that server language framework had some dynamic capabilities. It could talk to a database, talk to another service, and then what it would return to you was the full HTML that we wanted to render. This was great, but a consequence to this is every time we want to change something on the page, we need to make a full trip to the server and get that HTML back. So enter in the, Web 2.0 and the days of jQuery, we kind of simplified that, right? Like I want to make an AJAX request, I just want to get whatever that returns back. So HTMX is a library that allows you to access modern browser features directly from HTML rather than having to write JavaScript. And the way you do this is through attributes. HTML is small, very small, 14K min gzipped, dependency-free, extendable. And one of the things I love is they compare it to something like React, almost 70% less code than React to, again, maybe if you're building full-scale applications, it's not a one-to-one comparison. But if you just want to add some dynamic capabilities, definitely cool. I'm going to skip over this because I'm running out of time just to kind of show you a demo. And if we go here. Okay, so in the chat controller, I have two methods here. One is kind of using, sorry. There we go. So in the chat controller too, I have two kind of methods. One is, hey, I want to call the LLM and return the response. The way that you can do this in HTMX is, or at least in Timeleaf, is by returning a fragment. So I have a fragment for the response. So all this is the response that contains whatever we get back from the LLM. I have my main index HTML, which looks pretty similar to the one we had before. And then I have another method. So you can do this out of the box with HTMX. There are some things you might want to do, and there are some other libraries out there to help you do this. Vue component being one of them, and also our friend Wim's Spring Boot Timeleaf HTMX library that allows you to kind of combine two views. So I'm not going to run this, but in this scenario, I can basically, if we look at HTML, so I basically just adding some attributes here onto the HTML. I'm saying hx post. When you post this, I want to post to this endpoint. I'm targeting this response. So I have a div down here with our p paragraph tag with an ID of response. That's what I'm targeting. And the way I want you to swap that out is use the outer HTML. That's what we're replacing in the DOM. So I didn't write any JavaScript. If you were to run this, you can basically type in the message, post it to the server, just get back the HTML that is relevant. So you're not doing a full page render again. You just get back that HTML, and you're able to see that. And actually, I think I got a couple minutes. Let me just try this. So tell me a dad joke about cats. So we should get the response here. So we get that there. Why did the cat sit on the computer? Because it wanted to keep an eye on the mouse. That's a good one. So we're doing two things. One, we're adding the response to the page. But if you noticed on the left, we actually also added that to today's list. So as we type, we're kind of doing those two different things, and that's what that other library helped us with. So let me get back here and wrap up. Okay, so just some HTMX resources. Our friend Wim de Blau has a book on this, Modern Front Ends with HTMX. There's also a library helper for working with some of this. Thomas, who's sitting up here in the front row, who has a nice workshop on this later, has a good library on this as well called Spring Vue Component. And our friend Ted Young, aka Jitter Ted, does a lot of streaming on Twitch and YouTube. He does a lot of videos on HTMX. So if you're interested in learning more about that, that's a good place to start. So the answer that you all been waiting for, which one should you choose every single time, right? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. It really depends, right? It depends on some different things. Like, are you a solo developer or do you have a team? If I'm a solo developer and I'm working on like my side project, maybe I want to do that method where I had that front-end Vue framework inside of my Spring Boot project. Because now I don't have to manage two different projects, two different repositories. It's very easy. That may not be the case. You may be working on an existing project. Or there already is architecture of, hey, we have a separate Vue framework and we have a separate Spring Boot application. Developer skill set. if your team is all made up of Java developers and they don't have any experience with JavaScript, why shove a JavaScript framework down their throat unless there's a requirement for it, right? Maybe you could look at something like Vaadin to build out a front end for your application. Again, back office applications versus customer. Is SEO important? Do you need it to look good? Do you want a set of UI components out of the box? These are all things that you need to think of. Just a quick one, meet and greet with Josh Long today at the Spring booth. And then we're doing a live edition of Spring Office Hours tomorrow at the Spring booth as well. So with that, thank you. You can contact me at dan.vega@broadcom.com. Again, if you want to learn more about me, danvega.dev.